the dark shadows and in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast, we are the brave and bold. On the miraculous discovery of the Holy Sepulchre by the Empress Helena, the mother of Constantine, about 298 years after the death of Christ and the consequent erection by command of the first Christian emperor of the magnificent Church of the Resurrection, or as is now called, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Over the sacred monument, the tide of pilgrimage sent in towards Jerusalem and went on increasing in strength as Christianity gradually spread through Europe on the surrender of the Holy City to the victorious Arabians in AD 637, and privileges in the security of the Christian population were provided for in the following guarantee given under the hand and the seal of Caliph Omar of Sophronius the Patriarch. Under the government of the Arabians, the pilgrims continued steadily to increase. The old and the young, the women and children flocked in crowds to Jerusalem. And in the year 1064, the Holy Sepulchre was visited by an enthusiastic band of 7,000 pilgrims headed by the Archbishop of Mentz and the bishops of Utrecht, Bamberg, and Ratisbon. The year following, however, Jerusalem was conquered by the wild Turkomans. 3,000 of the citizens were indiscriminately massacred, and the hereditary command over the holy city and territory was confined to Emir Ortok, the chief of the savage pastoral tribes. Under the iron yoke of these fierce northern strangers, the Christians were fearfully oppressed and were driven from their churches. Divine worship was ridiculed and interrupted, and the patriarch of the holy city was dragged by the hair of his beard over the sacred pavement of the Church of the Resurrection and cast into a dungeon to extort a ransom from sympathy of his flock. The pilgrims who through innumerable perils had reached the gates of the holy city were plundered, imprisoned, and frequently massacred. And a uris, a piece of gold, was exacted as the price of admission to the Holy Sepulchre, and many, unable to pay the tax, were driven by the sword of the Turkomans from their very threshold of the object of all their hopes, the bourne of their long pilgrimage, and were compelled to retrace their weary steps in sorrow and anguish to their distant homes. The melancholy intelligence of the profanations of the holy places and the oppression and cruelty of the Turkomans aroused the religious chivalry of Christendom. A nerve was touched by exquisite feeling, and the sensation vibrated into the heart of Europe. Then arose the wild enthusiasm of the Crusades, men of all ranks and even monks and priests, animated by the exhortations of the Pope and the preachings of Peter the Hermit, flew to arms and enthusiastically undertook the pious and glorious enterprise of rescuing the Holy Sepulchre of Christ from the foul abominations of the heathen. When intelligence of the captured Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099 had been conveyed to Europe, the seal of pilgrimage blazed forth and increased fierceness. It had gathered intensity from the interval of its suppression by the wild Turkomans. And the promiscuous crowds of both sexes, and old men and children and virgins and matrons, thinking the road then open to the journey practicable, successfully pressed forward towards the holy city, with the passionate desire of contemplating the original monuments of the redemption. The infidels had indeed been driven out of Jerusalem, but not out of Palestine. The lofty mountains bordering the sea coasts were infested by bold and warlike bands of fugitive Muslims who maintained themselves in various impregnable castles and strongholds from whence they issued forth upon the high roads, cut off of communication between Jerusalem and the seaports, and revenged themselves for the loss of their habitation and property by the indiscriminate pillage of travelers. The Bedouin horsemen, moreover, making rapid incursions from beyond the Jordan, frequently kept to a desultory and irregular warfare in the plains. The pilgrims consequently, whether they approached the holy city by land or by sea, were like exposed to the almost daily hostility, to plunder, and to death. To alleviate the dangers and distress to which these pious enthusiasts were exposed, to guard the honor of the saintly virgins and matrons, and to protect the gray hairs of the venerable Palmer, 9 noble knights formed a holy brotherhood in arms, and entered into a solemn compact to aid one another in clearing the highways of infidels and of robbers, and in protecting the pilgrims through the passes and the defiles of the mountains to the holy city, warmed with the religious and the military fervor of the day, and animated by the sacredness of the cause to which they had devoted their swords. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Jesus Christ, and renounced the world and its pleasures and the holy church of the resurrection. In the presence of the patriarch of Jerusalem, they embraced vows of perpetual chastity, obedience, and poverty, after the manner of monks, uniting in themselves the 2 most popular qualities of the age, devotion and valor, and exercising them in the most popular of all enterprises, the protection of pilgrims. And of the road to the Holy Sepulchre, they speedily acquired a vast reputation and a splendid renown. At first, we are told that they had no church and no particular place of abode. But in the year of our Lord 1118, which was 19 years after the conquest of Jerusalem by the First Crusaders, they had rendered such a good and acceptable service to the Christians that Baldwin, the second king of Jerusalem, granted them a piece of habitation within the sacred enclosures of the temple on Mount Moriah, amid those holy and magnificent structures, partly erected by the Christian emperor Justinian and partly built by the Caliph Omar, which were then exhibited by the monks and priests of Jerusalem, whose restless zeal led them to the practice on the credulity of the pilgrims, and to multiply relics and all objects likely to be sacred in their eyes, as the temple of Solomon, whence the poor fellow soldiers of Jesus Christ came thenceforth to be known by the name the knighthood of the temple of Solomon. Ha! Giddy up! I forget it doesn't
the
launch
Abrahams,
like that.
occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
I made that one a little rough. Okay. Hey, hey, everybody. I'm John Towers. I'll be your Grand Master of the Order for this evening. Welcome to the Abercast. This is an extended episode from the Battle of Ascalon, which was kind of like the end of our First Crusade series. And I figured what a better bridge from like an epilogue of the First Crusade as in a prologue to the Second Crusade as to talk about. I'm sorry, I'm fucking with this. I messed up my whole mic taking picture. I took some pictures. I fucked everything up. Okay, so the featured books for tonight are all right, I'll get to that in a minute. We've talked about the Knights Templar on the show before, way back in the Baphomet episode, and I was like, we're going to have to cover these Templars sooner rather than later, and that was like a long time ago. And I was reading some damn thing or another that was making the case that these Templars were crypto-Islamists, and they the worshipping of Baphomet was some sort of bastardation or corruption, or maybe even some kind of coded stand-in for Muhammad, or maybe it's like to wrap your head around that is crazy. But in these days, post Dan Brown, in the age of Ancient Aliens and the Curse on Oak Island, folks link these Templars to every fucking thing. Every treasure, every weird religion, everything everywhere is tied to the Knights Templar. And I guess that's what's fascinating about them, right? We are not going to be talking about the downfall of the Templars. Obviously, that's going to be its whole own thing. This is like the origin of the Templar, the Knights of the Temple or whatever. They go by like a couple dozen fucking like different names. Some of the favorite theories is that they were secret goddess worshippers, or they had discovered some secret, like a golden treasure, or like the Holy Grail, or the like fucking Ark of the Covenant, or maybe it wasn't a golden treasure or a treasure of riches. Maybe it was a Gnostic secret, and they were all converted by this sacred knowledge. They were heretics reviving the first heresy under the very nose of the Pope in the Vatican itself. And they became the guardians of Christ's bloodline, and they worshipped the golden head of John the Baptist that talked to them. And it's said that the Templar fleet disappeared and became pirates, or they hid in Scotland, where they once again donned their armor and swords to help Robert the Bruce in the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Or they went to Switzerland and they used their banking experience to take over. I mean, it's a red and white cross, everybody. Or they discovered America. After all, Christopher Columbus also sailed under white sails with red crosses on them. I first got into all this Templar stuff in the 90s, and I fucking ate it up. I was at a prominent Freemasons farm, and I was digging through his library. We were drinking moonshine out of mason jars, and I was digging through his library, and I come across a old beat-up copy of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. I'm sure everyone's heard of this book by now, by Bayat Lay and Lincoln. And I pretty much read most of the book in one night. I was staying over there. So I got into it after that. I was like, Holy Blood, Holy Grail? What? And then I went and I found the Masonic Legacy, and then, the avalanche, the Templar avalanche had hit me. It's actually the Holy Blood, Holy Grail is actually my first, when I dipped my toe into Gnosticism for the first time. Cause they get, in that book, they get into, the Cathar, Crusade there. We've talked about that on the show before. So, we got to keep all this stuff in mind because it is fun to speculate. What if they actually were Muslims? That is a mind bender to me. But tonight we are going to, that sounds crazy because you're like, no, they were killing the Muslims. But you have to understand that there are accounts. So in the accounts of the Crusades, all were written on both sides, right? So if you go to the Muslim accounts of the Crusades, you'll find these little stories and these little passages by Muslim historians that write these stories. And there's this one classic one about a guy, he must have been like traveling to Jerusalem. He wasn't a native of Jerusalem because it was time for one of his prayers, and he was faced the wrong direction. And this Templar was like, yo, brother, you should be faced that way. That's the east. Like, he was trying to help the guy out so he could say his prayers the right way. And you're like, whoa. And the historian goes as far as to call the Templars his friends. So there is, this episode is not going to be about Muslims or Muslim pilgrims. But there are some stories about these Templars protecting all kinds of pilgrims, Jews, Christians, obviously, most importantly, specifically Christian pilgrims, but like also Muslim pilgrims. So if you're like, they were killing Muslims, like they can't. And you when you do research and stuff online, which is like, you will run into pages and pages of, comments and chat boards where they are just going nuts saying that the Crusaders would never, dig on Islam and Islam's teaching because they were there to kill Muslims. But you have to understand, it's just like today, right? Where it's like you have Muslims that are what we would call moderate. We have moderate Muslims, and then these Turkomans, as the book, the history of that cold open was from the History of the Knights Templar by Charles G. Addison, 1842. But as he talks about it, all the Muslims weren't like, it wasn't hunky dory that these Turkomans ran in there and took over. It's this radical expansionism that's the problem. Anyhow, I'm way off my script. I got to get back into what I'm talking about. It is fun to speculate, but if they were actually Muslims, right? But tonight we are going to focus on the actual history of the Knights Templar. And I've got to tell you guys that it's actually very difficult to find straight up history without all this theorizing and speculation. But I found one. I actually found two. So the feature books for this evening are The History of the Knights Templar by Charles G. Addison, 1842, and then The Knights Templar, 1120 to 1312 by Helen Nicholson. And she is a professor of medieval history at Cardiff University, and she's probably like the top Templar scholar probably in the world right now. She has published extensively on the subject and extensively on like the Hospitallers and probably like the Order of St. John or something like that. Like, she's an honest to goodness, like, it's not Clive Prince, like it's it's not Labe and Lincoln. What's her? I fucked their names up. And now I can't find it. Okay. Anyhow, it's not the Holy Blood, Holy Grail dudes. She's like a actual historian. She's got some stuff. So those are the two books we're working out of tonight. And so right now we're going to get into it. And I'd like to, my drink tastes like kerosene. I must have fucked the formula up. This is no longer a weapon of mass distraction. It's a weapon of, I don't know, I can't think of anything clever. It's a weapon of mass destruction. I don't know, whatever. It's not even clever. And I don't go through and re-edit these things, so I'm fucked. I just sound like an idiot right now. Anyhow, if you're playing along at home, charge your glasses. Adhere. Oh, well, that's not so bad. I might have just needed to mix it up a little bit. Adhere to the formula. Mix up your gin jihad and drink, and join me on this travel as we talk about the origins of the Knights Templar. Where were we at? Where'd I leave us? Oh, okay. The temple. So let's get to it. When these Crusaders took over Jerusalem, they took the mosques, and they yanked the crescents down and replaced it with a massive golden cross. The priests and whatnot got in there, and they prayed, and they consecrated their space with their holy water and all this, and with their incense and their frankincense and their myrrh. And it was called the Temple of the Lord. So we're going to jump in time a little bit. The fall of Jerusalem was 1099. The Templars were founded in or around about 1118 to 1119, and they made their home the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they believed was the Temple of Solomon. So they had that mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They had the southern side of the slab of rock it rests on, and then there was also like this mosque underneath it, and it was called El Marawani Mosque. And this is where the Templars kept their horses and their camels. This mosque was probably originally a water cistern that was built by Hadrian in the 2nd century, the same guy that built the wall. The Templars were founded by a veteran of the Crusades named Hugh of Pyles. This guy was sort of a radical, and he totally rethought the way that monks acted. He sort of lashed out a bit on this quiet monastic lifestyle. And he thought that instead of sitting around peacefully contemplating God and making wine, some members of the clergy should be fighters. In 1120, the clergy of the church council at Nabius agree that the new brotherhood is a valid religious order, and King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gives the brothers the former mosque called the Temple of Solomon. So this, you see, is how they become the Templars. When the holy city was taken by the Crusaders, the Dijam al-Aqsa, this is the mosque that we're talking about, and the various buildings constructed around it became the property of the kings of Jerusalem, and is denominated by William of Tyre as the palace or the royal house. South of the Temple of the Lord, it was vulgarly called the Temple of Solomon. It was this edifice or temple on Mount Moriah, which was appropriated by the use of the poor fellow soldiers of Jesus Christ, as they had no church and they had no particular place of abode. And from it, they derived their name, the Knights Templars. James of Vitry, Bishop of Acre, who gives an interesting account of the holy places, thus speaks of the temple of the Knights Templar. There is, moreover, at Jerusalem another temple of immense spaciousness and extent. From the brethrens of the knighthood to the temple derive their name of Templars, which is called the Temple of Solomon, perhaps to distinguish it from the one above described, which is specifically called the Temple of the Lord. That's the Holy Sepulchre. He moreover informs us that his Oriental history, now in these old documents, when you see Oriental history back then generally meant the Middle East. It generally meant the Middle East. I don't know why. I don't know why it's changed now. I don't know. but I do know that that's true. In the temple, the Lord, there is an abbot and canons regular, and be it known that one is the temple of the Lord and the other is the temple of the chivalry. These are clerks or other knights. The canons of the temple of the Lord concede to the poor fellow soldiers of a Jesus Christ. The large court extending between that building and the temple of Solomon, the king, the patriarch, and the prelates of Jerusalem, and the barons of the Latin kingdom assigned them various gifts and revenues for their maintenance and support, and to the order being now settled in a regular place of abode, the knights soon began to entertain more extended views and to seek a larger theater for the exercise of their holy profession. Holy profession is an awesome way to say to say it. The first aim and object had been, as before mentioned, simply to protect poor pilgrims on their journey backwards and forwards from the seacoast to Jerusalem. But as the hostile tribes of Mussulmans, which everywhere surrounded the Latin kingdom, were gradually recovered from the stupefying terror into which they had been plunged by the successful and exterminating warfare of the First Crusades, they were assuming an aggressive and threatening attitude. It was determined that the holy warriors of the temple should, in addition to the protection of the pilgrims, make a defense of the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, of the Eastern Church, and of all the holy places, a part of their particular profession. So you see, at the beginning, their story is 9 knights came together to protect pilgrims. But now they're like, you know what? We also need to have event staff at all these places. 2 of the most distinguished members of the fraternity. So they're creating a need. So the need's there. They're creating a solution. The 2 most distinguished members of the fraternity were Hugh de Payon and Geoffrey de Saint Aldemire, or Saint Omer. I think they go on to say Omer after this in at least one of the other books. 2 valiant soldiers of the cross who had fought with great credit and renown at the siege of Jerusalem. Hugh de Payon was chosen by the knights to be the superior of the new religious and military society by the title of the Master of the Temple. And he has consequently generally been called the founder of the order. The name and reputation of the Knights Templar speedily spread through Europe, and various illustrious pilgrims from the far west aspired to become members of the holy fraternity. Amongst these were Falk County of Anjou, who joined the society as a married brother in AD 1120 and annually remitted the order 30 pounds of silver. Baldwin, the king of Jerusalem, foreseeing the great advantages would accrue to the Latin kingdom by the increase of power and numbers of these holy warriors, exerted himself to the extent of the order throughout all of Christendom, so that he might, by means of so politic an institution, keep alive the holy enthusiasm of the West and draw constant succor from the bold and warlike races of Europe for the support of his Christian throne and kingdom. In 1120, they have a good story to tell, right? Like, these fucking guys have an awesome story to tell. They're like, hey, we're just sitting around after the Crusades, and we're like, 9 of us bros. We're like, hey, someone should do something about the rape and pillage and theft of these pilgrims that are just coming here to, be in the Holy Land. It's like, who doesn't want to get behind that shit? And also, we're going to talk a little bit about this, but their craziness in the battlefield is legendary. A lot of the stuff that we hear nowadays on Ancient Aliens or whatever the fuck History Channel thing that you're watching is just like, oh, well, they were like bankers and they did this and they had wheat and they made these round churches because they're like pussies. They're not like pussies, but the round churches are like pussies. Like, this is the kind of shit that you immerse yourself into when you start looking at the wild speculation involved in the Templars. But, what is barely ever said is that these guys were lunatics on the battlefield. They were like, I mean, people were like, they're the special forces of their day. But I mean, I've run across some of the like firsthand accounts of what these fucking guys did on the battlefield. I'm keeping them for a later episode, but I felt like I should mention them here because there's very little action in this episode, but it's all around the periphery. Like it's everywhere with these guys. Violence of action is a moment away. They got a piece of sharp metal in their hands. You know, they're rushing to their death, just like jihadists. Like, they call it martyrdom. And, you know, the Muslims call it jihad. But, it's wild. I can't wait to get into some of this stuff with you, especially when we get into the Second Crusade. The Siege of Ascalon. We're going to get into it, bros. We're going to get into it. Okay. So this guy, this king is using their story because he's like, as long as these guys are the motherfuckers in charge, I am going to be in charge of them. So he thinks. In 1128, the dude who was in charge, Hugh de Payens, and his dudes started like this PR campaign. So you could see there's political motivation and they need to expand. So much of this stuff has to do with the politics of the day, between the kings. Right now we're thinking about the king of Jerusalem and the guys in charge of the places in like Palestine, you know, and the Pope. Those are like the two main political forces we need to start thinking about. But eventually, as their wealth and their operation grows, literally they have their fingers in the the politics of each little fiefdom. And some will say that's part of the thing that led to their downfall, you know. In 1129, 10 years after their foundation, here it is, right? Classically, jumping the gun on my own notes. The Templars receive an official papal approval, and the rules of the order are established. So before we get into these rules, we're going to do this. God, I did it again. All right. We're going to talk a minute about what does it mean to be a Templar Knight? We all know some of their rules. They couldn't retreat unless they were outnumbered like 20-1. They couldn't leave the battlefield if their flag was still on it. They would never pay ransom for a kidnapped brother. And they had to fight to the death, etc., etc., etc. However, those are like the big broad strokes. There was other rules of the order, like they were just talking about this Hugh de Payen, and I think the bishop of somebody, sat down and wrote these rules out. So I feel like I just need to say like what a knight was back in these days is it was like you had a land and you had title, but you swore fealty to a king. Well, the Templars were different, and at the end of all this rule writing, the Templars were different. They didn't have land, they didn't have wealth, and they didn't have a king. They answered to La Popita. They answered to the Pope. So we call them Templar Knights, but it's crazy because it's like it's a new thing, right? It's not really a knight. It's like a monk, a hyper violent monk had sex with a knight. A hyper violent monk had sex with a knight, and out comes like this Templar baby. They were forbidden. They're like on the wall. They were forbidden to hold lands and all this stuff. But that's not to say they were without rank. They had rank. They had like Templar. They were the order of the Templar Knights, farmers or administrators. Again, it's a lot like the wall. They have the builders and the stewards and the rangers. These guys had, folks that would cook for them, people that would do their legal stuff for them, like a little bit later on, not just at the founding or just like 10 years later when they would get their papal approval. So let's get into these rules. The rule of the poor fellow soldiers of Jesus Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It was arranged by Saint Bernard Clairvaux. I think we're going to talk about him a little bit later. And it was sanctioned by the Holy Fathers of the Council of Troyes. It looks like it says Troyes, but it's the Council of Troyes. I'm not a French speaker, so I just know that. I don't know how I know it. For the government and regulation of the monastic and military society of the temple is principally of a religious character. So look at that. Like right off the bat, they're saying it's principally a religious character. But when we think of the Knights Templar, we think of principally a military character, right? And of an austere and gloomy cast. It is divided into 72 heads or chapters and is preceded by a short prologue addressed to all who maybe this religious character is they're talking about the rules and regulations. I should have read better. To all who disdain to follow their own wills and desire with purity of mind to fight for the Most High and true King, exhorting them to put on the armor of obedience and to associate themselves together with piety and humility for the defense of the Holy Catholic Church, and to employ pure diligence and steady purveyance in the exercise of their sacred profession, here or so that they may share in the happy destiny reserved for the holy warriors that had given up their lives for Christ. That's this principle of martyrdom that they're rushing towards, just like a jihadist rushing towards that martyrdom. The rule enjoins several devotional exercises: self-mortification, fasting, and prayer, and constant attendance at Martins, Vespers, and all the services of the church. So Martins and Vespers are little services. I don't know what the particularities of them are, like why it stands apart from a mass. I don't know. I wasn't that interested. that being refreshed and satisfied with heavenly food, instructed and stabilized by heavenly precepts, after the consummation of the divine mysteries, none may be afraid of the fight, but be prepared for the crown. If unable to attain the regular service of God, the absent brother is for Martins. Again, it's this other sort of church function. It's like the potluck after the mass, I guess. You got to bring your stew and your corn on the cob and your ambrosia salad to be prepared for the crown. To say over 13 paternosters. I don't know what a paternoster is, but I know someone named Paternostra, which I think is weird. Would you like to know more? Click here. Yes. For every hour 7 and for the Vespers 9, I'm just going to skip ahead because I'm tired of telling you that I don't know what I'm talking about. Moreover, say the Holy Father, we do strictly enjoin you that with divine and most tender charity you do daily bestow as much meat and drink as was given to that brother when alive. Unto some poor man for 40 days, brethren are on all occasions to speak sparingly. We wear a grave and serious deportment, and they are to be constant in the exercise of charity and almsgiving, and to have a watchful care over all sick brethren, and to support and sustain all old men. They are not to receive letters from their parents, relations, or friends without the license of the master, and all gifts are immediately to be taken to the latter, or to the treasurer, to be disposed of as he may direct. There are, moreover, to receive no service or attendance from a woman, brother, and are commanded over all things to shun feminine kisses. Well, we're going to skip around a little bit. We're going to skip down here. Rule 8. In one common hall or refectory, we will that you take meat together, wherein if your wants cannot be made known by signs, ye are softly and privately to ask for what you want. If at any time the thing you require is not to be found, you must seek it with all gentleness and with all submission and reverence to the board, in remembrance of the words of the apostle, eat thy bread in silence, and in emulation of the psalmist, who says, I have set a watch upon my mouth, that is, I have communicated with myself that I may not offend, that is, with my tongue. That is, I have guarded my mouth that I may not speak evil. They can only eat 3 meals of meat a week, except for Christmas, Easter, and you can never eat alone. There needs to be 2 dudes eating and keeping an eye on each other, which I thought was really weird, because like the prior rule, they can't talk to each other. So just imagine sitting there just across the table, just eating with some other dude, just being like, giving each other hand signs, the okay sign. Oh, this mutton is pretty good. That reminds me of like when I lived in Europe. In Europe, it's perfectly okay if you're sitting at a table all alone by yourself at a restaurant. They can just walk up and sit, and they can be like, hey, can I sit here? And you'd be like, I guess, if you want to. And they'll just sit there with you. They'll sit there with you. They don't necessarily make small talk. They don't want to know about you generally. They just, for some reason, they just want to sit around you. The whole fucking rest of the restaurant could be empty, but they want to just hang out and just eat with you. I always thought that was really weird. Not at a bar so much, because at a bar you get jaw jacking, you know. Speaking of jaw jacking, I think I'm going too long. I might just skip to the end of this fucking thing. Rule 16. When the sun leaveth the eastern region, and descends into the west, the ringing of the bell or other customary signal, you must all go and do evening prayer. But we wish you beforehand to take a general repast. But this repast we leave to the regulation and judgment of the master. Or Rule 20, to all professed knights, both winter and summer, we give, if they can be procured, white garments, that those who have cast behind them a dark life may know that they are to commend themselves to their Creator by a pure and white life. For what is whiteness but perfect chastity? And chastity is the security of the soul and the health of the body. 23, we have decreed in common council that no brother should wear skins or cloaks of anything serving as a covering for the body in the winter, even the cassock made of the skins, except they be skins of lambs. They can have 3 horses. I'm just going to roll through some of these. They can have 3 horses, but only 1 squire. So you know that famous thing where it's like they're sharing a horse. There's 2 of them sharing a horse. Like that just seems like it's propaganda to me. Like these guys can have 3 horses, but only 1 squire, and they can't strike the squire as a punishment. But again, there is more stuff about them not being able to speak to each other. They actually elaborate this in a later rule, and they say, quote, since every idle word is known to beget sin, that what can those who boast of their own faults say before the strict judge? The prophet showeth wisely that if we ought sometimes be silent and to refrain from good discourse in the sake of silence, how much the rather would we refrain from evil words on the account of the punishment of sin? We forbade, therefore, and we resolutely condemn all tales related by any brother of the follies and irregularities of which he hath been guilty in the world or in the military matters, either with his brother or with any other men. So this is a rule this specifically is a rule against talking shit and reveling. You know, I can't imagine the amount of times that after when I was in the security universe, when I was in the security world, like having to dust up and then not going to the bar that night and telling everybody about it. Like, I fucking karate chopped that dude in the fucking throat. That's what this rule is about. They can't do I used to call them after action reviews. They can't do after action reviews. And lastly, we hold it dangerous to all religion to gaze too much on the countenance of women, and therefore no brother shall presume to kiss either widow, nor virgin, nor mother, nor sister, or aunt, or any other woman. Let the knighthood of Christ shun feminine kisses, though which men have very often been drawn into danger, so that each with a pure conscience and the secure life may be able to walk everlastingly in the sight of God. So how do these guys wind up getting so powerful? How do they get so rich as an organization? Well, upon joining the Templars, you kind of have to give them all of your stuff. And then as time continued going and their reputations grew, there was a certain amount of, I guess we would call it nowadays, virtue signaling. It was important, I think, in Western culture to be seen supporting the Templars. And if you wanted their help guarding a frontier or something, you'd have to pay. And being a religious order and doing God's work and answering only to the Pope, that's a pretty good story to tell, In the early 1130s, the Abbot Clairvaux, this guy was like a rock star of the church. He actually believed that the Templars were not just protecting pilgrims. When they were cleaving down Muslim raiders, they were fighting evil. And he goes on to write in praise of the new knighthood, to encourage the new order, and probably to help with recruitment. In 1131, Count Raymond Burger III gives the Templars a border stronghold in Granada. In 1134, King Alfonso I dies and gives his whole fucking kingdom to the Templars. In 1136 to 1137, Templars move in and establish a frontier in northern Antioch in Syria. In 1137, the Queen of England gives the Templars a ton of land in Essex. 1139, Pope Innocent III issues a papal document containing a set of religious privileges for all Templars. In 1140, that's important. These papal decrees with religious privileges. We're going to see it again here in a few years. 1143, the Count of Barcelona enlists the Templars into the war against the Muslims in Spain. This is a topic that's been coming up over and over again for us for a few months now. Is this the Muslim occupation of Spain, which we've been talking about it. So as a reward, they're given castles and lands, huge tracts of lands. In 1144, Pope Celestine II issues more privileges to the Templars than under a year later, a brand new Pope, Eugenius the third, gives them even more privileges. They get a double dose. They get a double shot of privileges in 1144. They make it until 1146 before they officially adopt the iconic Red Cross. And we are able to trace this little bit of historical trivia to this guy, the Lord Robert, Master of the Temple. Master of the Temple was at this period, AD 1146. Yeah, I just said that. Succeeded by Ivard de Bérez, Priory of France, who convened a general chapter on the Order of Paris, which was attended by Pope Eugenius III, Louis VII, King of France, and many prelates, princes, and nobles from all parts of Christendom. The Second Crusade was there arranged, and the Templars were sanctioned of the Pope. Assumed the blood red cross, the symbol of martyrdom, as the distinguished badge of the order, which was appointed to be worn on their habits and their mantles on the left side of their breasts over their heart, whence they came afterwards to be known by the names of the Red Friars and the Red Cross Knights. At this famous assembly, various donations were made to the Templars to enable them to provide more effectual for their defense of the Holy Land. Bernard Balolol, I guess, through the love of God and the good of his soul, granted them his estate in Wendeley in Hertfordshire, which afterwards formed a part of the preceptory of the Temple Dionysiae. This grant is expressed to be made at the chapter held at Easter in Paris, in the presence of the Pope, the King of France, several archbishops, and 130 Knights Templar clad in white mantles. So this is where I get the idea that it was popular to virtue signal. It was, even back then, they were like, oh, the universe has got to see me giving money to these motherfuckers. In 1147, the Second Crusade officially starts, when the county of Addison falls. The county of Addison falls. And that's something that we kind of set up in the Battle of Ascalon episode. So that brings us kind of full circle. And that's the story of the origin of the Knights Templar. And I'm I'm your Grand Master of the Temple this evening, John Towers, and you guys have been awesome. And thank you for tuning in and finding us and all that other good stuff. And have a good evening. Night. Here. Hold on. Here, this is to you guys. Hey guys, it's John. I just wanted to remind you to check out the American Sermon. It's a limited series podcast. This is the last month. It's ending, where we're talking about the occult foundations of the United States. If you like the show, you'll definitely like that. So check her out wherever for most places you can find podcasts. And if you're interested in supporting the show, please head over to Subscribestar. It's subscribestar.com/Abercast, and it's a Patreon alternative in the fact of the techno censorship over there at Patreon. We went ahead and we got out of Dodge, and we're over at Subscribestar now. Subscribestar.com/Abercast. Give it a check out. Get over there. Check out our tiers and shit. Don't forget to go to abercast.com. Social media links are there. Sign into the mailing list for some bonus content. The website also has a featured topic link, so you can just search whatever you're interested in and find all the shows pertaining to that right there. It's pretty nifty. And don't forget to check out the Abercast Facebook page. I'm pretty sure it's just facebook.com/the Abercast. So, yep, that's it. Oh, boy. The Templars were founded by... Hold on. I'm sorry. There's an Alexa upstairs going crazy. I can't figure out what it's listening to. The Templars were founded by veteran of the Crusades named Hugh D. Pyles, or Hugh of Pyles. What? What? The Templars were founded by a veteran of the Crusades named Hugh of Pyles, or Hugh de Pyles. This guy was sort of a radical, and he totally rethought the way monks acted. He sort of lashed out a bit on this quiet monastic lifestyle. He thought that instead of sitting around peacefully contemplating God or making wine, some members of the clergy should be fighters. In 1120, the clergy of the church council at Nabius agreed that the new brotherhood is a valid religious order, and King Baldwin II of Jerusalem gives the brothers the former mosque, called the Temple of Solomon. So this, you see, is how they become the Templars. When the holy city was taken by the Crusaders, the Dejam al-Alaska, with the various that's the Alaska mosque that we were just talking about. For some reason that's very hard for me to pronounce, because I just keep thinking about Alexa. With the various buildings constructed around it, became the property of the kings of Jerusalem, and is denoted by...
I'm not sure about that.
I asked for it. I fucking asked for that.